Hello, YouTube. My name is Ian Adel, and I am officially starting a YouTube channel. Today's lecture is going to be on why the 2024 United States presidential election broke the pattern of history. Dr. Alan Lichtman is a professor at American University who called the election for Kamala Harris. I have also called the election for Kamala Harris, the first time ever I incorrectly predicted a presidential election. Now, first and foremost, you cannot contend that the keys to the White House are invalid because this election broke the pattern of history. There is something in political science called critical elections, okay? And that's important. So, under the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd United States president, that itself had a different emerging factional group among the interests of Democrats under the New Deal coalition. The 1860 United States presidential election was a critical election, especially at the collapse of the Whig Party. What makes 2024 a critical election, that I argue, is because individuals were widely accepting incorrect information. First and foremost, I'm not advocating for President Joe Biden when I say this, but President Biden received a lot of hatred all throughout the continuation of his presidency. You realize there are many Americans who believe that we are in a recession today, and that is not correct. A recession requires at least 5 months of negative GDP growth. Under the President Biden's administration, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips for Science bill greatly improved the long-term real per capita growth of our economy. Americans don't see this, and they don't understand this. I do empathize with them that the cost of living is crazy. It's very expensive. Go to the gas pump. Go to the grocery store. It is unquestionable that the cost of living is very expensive, especially for the average American, for the average single mother, for the average father who are working very difficult. But what if I told you that is because of our capitalistic society and our society that's founded on individualism? So, reflecting on the keys now, it's still proven, according to political science, that the incumbency advantage greatly impacts how election trajectory works. So is third party contest. So is party contest key. The problem in 2024 was it dealt with superdelegates from the beginning. As Dr. Alan Lichtman says, the spineless Democrats. I call them the spineless superdelegates of the presidential convention and the Democratic convention. Because in this convention, you need to understand that the elites of the party removed a democratically appointed nominee, and that appointee was Joe Biden. Never in American history have we ever saw superdelegates remove the Democratic nominee from the national convention. See, the Republican nomination doesn't have superdelegates, okay? Based on how you win individual states on majority and or plurality, which a plurality is just you're winning the state, but not by a majority, not by over 50%, but you might win by 1 or 2 votes or more. Typically it's more, but a plurality is something that's at 49%. You still have a majority that did not support you, and that's the reason why they kind of break apart the delegates in the convention. So, number one, you need to understand that the superdelegates removed President Biden from the nomination. President Biden got removed. That, I think, started to divide key voting blocks that used to support Biden that now support, third party, or even flipped against Kamala Harris. Now, it is unequivocally certain that Republicans still could have won this election for just due to the dissemination of disinformation arguments. But the most important thing to look at is key voting blocks turned against Vice President Harris. Now, when you're a Democrat, you need to win. You know what I'm saying? You need to support collective efficacy. You need to win widespread. Not just win, you know what I'm saying, among one or two key voting blocks. Now, Hispanic voters turned against Kamala Harris in big numbers. Arab voters did, and do you blame them? Because they didn't trust Kamala Harris. They didn't think Kamala Harris was a good asset to the party, and she would not deviate from what they believed to be President Biden's catastrophe in the Middle East. And he does share responsibility for what happened. He did work on a ceasefire deal. However, the ceasefire deal is going to substantially impact, you know what I'm saying, Palestinians in big numbers. Really, it really will. And I'm hoping that this ceasefire goes to phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 as soon as possible. Now, yes, many people are going to disagree with me. But you need to understand that the fighting needs to stop. Too many men, too many women, and too many children are dying in the Middle East since October 7th of 2023. We're talking about children. We got to stop the genocide that's happening in Palestine. Now, if you look at the keys to the White House, Joe Biden did not receive a party mandate. If anything, after Joe Biden won the election, he started losing House of Representative seats. Okay? So he did not have a party mandate. The incumbent was not running for re-election. But this is where I think Dr. Lichtman got it incorrect. The contest key. But he didn't have any other source to reference. So you can't blame him. History changed itself on a whim. Because the contest key cannot remain true and favor the re-election of the White House party if superdelegates remove a democratically elected nominee and replace it with someone who doesn't appeal to the masses. Harris appealed to the elites and the unions, but she didn't appeal to voting blocks in the manner that President Biden did. President Biden appealed to many more voting blocks than Vice President Harris. So that's my first argument. My second argument is that there was no foreign policy major success under the Biden administration, turning that false. Now, Dr. Lichtman, I do agree with you that NATO and building back the coalition during the Russia and Ukraine scandal were humongous successes, especially among a 21st century president. I agree with you. But they were certainly not as strong as détente or the SALT talks that existed, or even glasnost or perestroika under the Reagan administration. So you can't really contend that as a major success. If anything, the collapse of Afghanistan, the war in the Middle East, were all major foreign policy failures. Now, according to political science, I don't believe they're all failures. But looking at the selective perception of American voters, especially because they're very apathetic towards how politics works, they consider it a failure. That's why I say it's a failure. Doesn't necessarily mean in reality it is, but the American people don't understand that. That's the problem. We need to have more education. This is another reason why I strongly condemn Republicans for threatening to shut down the U.S. education department. Sure, they might try to argue that devolution resolutions are needed in accordance with our federal system, stating that the national government did not have such power, which they may be correct in that context. But they need to also understand that helping preserve the fabric of society and the education of K through 12 students is fundamental. Fundamental. And if we deviate too much from supporting education, or we totally abolish it, like Trump's Project 2025 plan says, which, remember, it still needs congressional approval, and I don't see that happening. I might see some of its powers being diluted, but I don't see it totally being abolished, especially among the 60-vote filibuster requirement that John Thune just said he would preserve. But the problem is in America, let's say that I'm a voter, okay? I'm going to illustrate a picture now. Let's say that I'm a voter. Voter A hears from, let's say, presidential candidate Ian Adel. We are going to expand your freedom of speech, okay? We're going to expand your freedom of speech rights in America, right? First of all, that doesn't even really make any sense because the Constitution already supports freedom of speech. But among voter A that likes to hear that, they're going to say, yes, absolutely. I love the ideas of expanding freedom of speech. We need limited government. And I might get independent support for that. And I'm going to get support among both sides of the aisle for that one policy. Even if they don't vote for me, they'll agree with that statement. But they don't understand that it's a pointless statement, just trying to get me to get more support. That's what candidates are doing. Trump did that with grocery prices. You see what I'm saying? Trump promised the world that he was going to manage inflation better than President Biden. President Biden has little to no power over inflation. Okay? Little to none. But the American people believe he wasn't addressing their concerns. So, the economy argument is the argument just to get conservative factions to agree with their friends that the economy's bad and Biden need to get out. The next argument was the immigration argument. Okay? Never in American history since 1882 and 1924 can I think of how nativist our country has become. And what do I mean by nativist? How scared and how xenophobic we are towards immigration and towards immigrants. We are a nation founded on immigration. If you want to deport people here who are illegal, you got to deport every single one of us. You want to know why? Because we are on indigenous people's land currently. Native Americans. Native Americans were treated horrible throughout our society. Just look at the 1830 Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears under his administration. That's really where we started saying America is exceptionalist. A key term that Trump just used in his inauguration speech to justify that America is above all other countries. And it has this, basically like this religious ethnocentrism, which means we are bigger and better than any other country in the world, and we should preempt any other people's rights. And now, not only are we extending that worldwide, we are now extending that to impact many, many people in our society today. Trump wants to get rid of protections for a lot of people. Now, I know Republicans are afraid of LGBTQ rights. Okay? I know they're afraid of that. And I also know the argument that the Bible says that they want to use. But you need to understand, if you truly believe in that, you're not going to judge them. And they deserve their freedom just like you and just like anybody else. They're no different than any other person. And it doesn't mean that their freedom should be stripped away just because they're different. Remember, when we came over into America, Native Americans were not agreeing with what Europeans were doing. And then they used warfare to basically silence their petition of grievances with chattel slavery when it came into America. When they deviated away from the norms because there was injustice, they were penalized. You see what I'm saying? Now, because people's lifestyles may deviate away from what a white conservative evangelical Christian supports, they're bad and they should be condemned. And that's reprehensible. Absolutely reprehensible in its entirety. Next point I want to address with the reason why election 2024 really broke the pattern of history. And that's because of the fear of socialism. There is this widespread fear in society that socialism is a scary force and that Kamala Harris was a socialist. Now, I'm not going to argue on here whether socialism or capitalism or communism is good or better than any other doctrine. I am here to rebuke the argument that Kamala Harris was a socialist. That's different. She certainly believes in Keynesian economics, which may align with a socialist ideology, but that doesn't make her socialist. That's sort of like someone saying that a Republican is someone who 100% identifies with conservative ideology, and that's not necessarily true. Now, Kamala Harris is a social liberal Democrat, okay? Social Democrat. She's a little more progressive than President Biden. President Biden's a little more moderate than she is. But she believed in a similar economy that President Biden believed in. That the middle class should be the ones that's ruling the economy. Not this trickle-down economics philosophy. Now, ever since the Republican Revolution of 1994, long after President Reagan was out of office, we started seeing small shifts into this reactionary conservative movement that started deviating away from conservative traditionalism and supporting more traditionalist reactionary theories. Now, these factions, as what James Madison would contend, started to emerge into our society, and it started integrating. Then it started becoming more evident that people that were more rich and more upper class were starting to cling on to these theories. And it didn't matter what their race or gender was necessarily. It's a class issue. Socioeconomic status is what's dividing America. Big time. Not the proliferation of groups and hyperpluralism. It is actually elite class theory that is justified in this argument. That there is a top 1%, a top 10%, and there's a bottom 99 and 90%. That is being exploited and is also being benefited. And I think you know which class is being exploited and which one is being benefited. I don't need to say it on here. The problem is super PACs were going behind and supporting these 1% and top 10% groups. And these top 1 and top 10% groups were going all in and on board with supporting a man who threatened democracy, who threatened to terminate the Constitution, and who is an adjudicated insurrectionist, and launched advertisements, especially in the South, where they don't have a lot of educational opportunities because of the Republican platform in the South, Whether they want them or not, education is still fundamental with understanding how these intricacies work. It doesn't matter if they don't want it. It doesn't matter if they do want it. To understand how politics and how government works, we need to be educated. Now, truth be told, teachers and schools are not trying to indoctrinate children, okay? They're not. And we need them. We need schools in our society, okay? So that's what really shifted and made a big transformation in this reactionary conservative movement. People in society are no longer just, in my eyes, Democrat, Independent, Republican. We're already skewed more to the right. If you're an independent, you align more with conservative ideology. And if you're a Republican, you are a far-blown reactionary. Far-blown, just reactionary. And if you are a Democrat, you're more of an independent. And if you're a progressive, you are a far-blown liberal. Okay? Not even just a liberal. Yeah, liberal or socialist or even communist. But that makes very, very small fluctuations. But if you take a look at the curves, the liberal ideology on the far left, the far, far left, is a lot narrower than the reactionaries that are becoming more expansive. Because we are shifting more from the left, and the curve is shifting us to the right. There are a lot more independents and more conservatives, I agree. But because of that far-blown reactionary shift after the 1994 Republican Revolution and into our, second Republican Revolution, and with the people that fall in the middle that are already skewed to the right because of the dissemination of disinformation. Now, these are very hardworking people, and I would never contend that they're bad people. They're people that work hard. They're people who are blue-collar workers. They're people who are in the middle class. I understand that. I understand not everyone can be like me and sit home every day and listen to politics and be a nerd. But I do also know that because people don't do that, in essence, our society is becoming more threatened every single day. James Madison created a system to dilute this factional issues that emerge. He understood that factions were good. We need factions. But when the factions' power becomes so concentrated and so widespread in our society, tyranny of the majority can take place. And we are seeing that occur. But we still have one more protection that Republicans are forgetting about. And that is federalism. The system of shared governance between federal, state, county, and local governments at all levels. Now, Brutus did argue that based on a large scope, our society would become so aggrandized in a central government that we could not long subsist local interests. And local interests would always be on the chopping block for interests all across, society that didn't really impact them. But because they were in the minority and, another factional interest was in the majority, they would always be preempted. So we created a system of federalism to create laws to address that specific interest and for them to address their own interests, and a central government to address the interests and the moral fabric and preservation of the Union in its entirety. Now, I'm not saying that Republicans are always going to be extreme right-wing factions. And I'm not saying that Democrats are always going to be extreme left-wing factions, okay? But what I am saying is, that's important, we need to become a more educated society. Because remember, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there were still people that were disenfranchised, but you didn't see this factional movement that is a result of misinformation. and how they can twist the tiniest details in our society. And I think that's the reason why 2024, one could argue, is a critical election. The shift from being what's called an ideology or a rational choice voter into a more less pragmatic, um, retrospective and prospective voter. All right, thank you for tuning in. Come on for my next lecture. Ian Adel out.